There's a moment that sneaks up on you when you least expect it. It's not marked by any dramatic event, not a slammed door, or a glaring betrayal that you can point to and make sense of. It's far more subtle than that. One morning, you simply wake up and notice that the rhythm of your life has shifted. The sounds, the connections, the vibrancy feel different. The calls you used to get are fewer and far between. The quick check-ins that once filled your days have become shorter, almost dismissive. Those people who once seemed woven into the fabric of your everyday existence now feel distant, harder to reach, difficult to read, almost elusive. And if you're truly honest with yourself, that kind of silence can sting more deeply than outright rejection. It sparks a flood of internal questions you never imagined you'd ask. Have I become too intense? Too withdrawn? Am I changing in ways that make me less relatable? Did I somehow become less enjoyable to be around? Have I disappointed those I care about without even realizing it? Has my personal growth inadvertently pushed people away? Or worse, was I only lovable when I stayed the same? Yet, what if this thinning of your social circle isn't a sign of being forgotten or losing your worth? What if this reduction isn't about losing value but about gaining clarity? Maybe, just maybe, God isn't emptying your life because you're losing something precious. Maybe He's pruning away what's noisy, crowded, or tangled, removing the distractions so you can move forward into the next chapter. Tonight, I want to gently unfold a truth that aches before it brings relief. Some of the most unsettling seasons in life don't start with catastrophe. Instead, they begin quietly with less noise, less affirmation, less access, less emotional traffic jostling your soul. And at first, less almost always feels like loss. But what if less isn't always loss? What if it's the start of something more precise? What if that silence you dread is actually the space where God begins to separate what brings temporary comfort from what truly sustains? What if your circle is shrinking not because you failed but because your life can no longer revolve around those who only stayed when things were easy? By journey's end, I hope you see it differently. Not everyone who pulls away is being taken from you. Not every closed door signals a rejection of your worth. And not every quiet season means something has gone wrong. Sometimes, the life God is building inside you cannot take shape while old voices still have unrestricted access. Sometimes, the crowd thins because learning to listen to yourself and to God is more important than popularity. And sometimes, the first sign that God is drawing you closer is that everything around you suddenly falls still. When familiar faces no longer feel familiar, the temptation is to rationalize, to blame business, mismatched schedules, exhaustion, or the natural ebb and flow of life. People have their own struggles, you tell yourself. No need to read too much into it. But explanations only last so long, and when the pattern keeps repeating, they begin to wear thin. Then, the truth you've been avoiding starts to whisper in the silence. The very people who once made space for him now seem to only fit him in. Those same individuals who used to genuinely ask how he was doing now responded with a subtle distance, an indefinable but unmistakable shift in tone. Relationships that once felt effortless suddenly demanded an unusual amount of effort just to remain stable and normal. He hadn't grown hostile. He hadn't withdrawn. He hadn't done anything blatantly wrong. If anything, he had grown more sincere. His prayer life deepened, his patience for distraction dwindled, and his sense of what truly mattered sharpened. He wasn't louder or more confrontational. In fact, he was cleaner in spirit and intention. Strangely, this made certain spaces harder to remain in. This contradiction unsettled him. If he had drifted morally, he could have understood the fallout. If arrogance had taken root, he might have blamed himself. If he had grown cold, dismissive, or self-righteous, then perhaps the distance would have made sense. But none of that was true. He hadn't become harder. He had become more honest. And honesty changes the dynamics of certain relationships far faster than most realize. He noticed these shifts, in small, quiet ways first. Conversations that once felt rich now seemed thin. Places that had felt natural now felt cramped and uncomfortable. Topics that once held his interest offered no pull anymore. The clearer he became inwardly, the more obvious it was that some connections had been propelled by momentum rather than genuine depth. That's a difficult truth to accept, because momentum often feels like intimacy, until life slows enough for you to see the difference clearly. He tried to keep perspective. He kept showing up, kept being kind, kept making room, kept reminding himself that not every moment had to carry deep meaning. But inside, a heavier question hovered endlessly. Why, the deeper I go with God, do certain people begin to feel less natural around me? One night, that question shed its abstraction. As he sat in quiet prayer, his words weren't polished or eloquent. They were simple and dry. Lord, why does obedience feel like it costs company? It wasn't a strong prayer, not filled with spiritual language. Instead, it was the kind we pray when we're exhausted from trying to make sense of our own pain. And in that stillness, a new thought began to rise. Maybe the pain wasn't only in people feeling distant. Maybe the deeper ache was realizing how much of himself had depended on them staying close. This kind of realization doesn't come gently, because it uncovers a truth few want to face. Sometimes, what we call connection carries more than just connection. Sometimes it carries reassurance. Sometimes it carries identity. Sometimes it carries the quiet need to feel seen, affirmed, and emotionally anchored by others. And when that support starts to fade, the ache isn't just relational. It's structural. It exposes the very foundation that your inner life had been leaning on. That's why these seasons hit harder than they seem on the surface. It's not just about friendship being tested. It's about confronting dependency disguised as normal closeness. He began to see this more clearly. Some of the people he missed weren't wrong for him, not in a simple way, but they had become too central in his life in ways he never fully acknowledged. Their presence soothed him more than it should have. Their approval steadied him more than it should have. Their closeness comforted parts of him where only God should have been the ultimate refuge. Admitting this isn't easy. It's far simpler to blame others than to scrutinize your own attachments. But when God starts to cleanse those attachments, certain relationships begin to feel different even before they fade away completely. Not because love disappears, but because misplaced reliance is exposed. There's a kind of mercy that doesn't start by giving you more, it starts by revealing what's had too much control over your peace. And once that mercy begins its work, the circle of people around you often changes long before you understand why. He wasn't just observing people leaving. He was witnessing God uncover what had become overly necessary. This didn't make the loneliness vanish, but it transformed it from pointless ache into meaningful revelation. And those two are very different. Meaningless suffering traps you in confusion, while meaningful pain opens the door to surrender. So that was the first lesson. Not every shift in your social life is a judgment. Some are revelations. And revelations sting the most when they touch the things your soul quietly depended on like oxygen. Let me ask you, have you ever gone through a season where the people around you seemed to change? Not because you got worse, but because you got more serious about what God was doing inside you. Because if that's happened, the first question might not be who left, but what did their staying really mean to me? When God strips away what once felt like security, the next phase is even harder, because it isn't just personal confusion anymore. It starts to feel like a pattern. It's not just one person, or one awkward silence, or a single relationship growing cold on the edges. It's bigger than that. The whole circle feels different. And the human heart panics when it notices this kind of shrinking. One loss can be explained. Several start to feel like a message. He felt that tension rising. The room around him was quieter than before. The support he expected without asking was no longer automatic. The sense of being surrounded was fading. And with that came a fear he was almost too embarrassed to say aloud. What if I'm becoming less wanted the more I grow? This question hurt not because it was noble, but because it was true. Many people long to know God's will for their lives. Yet, at the same time, they want enough witnesses around them to make following that will feel socially safe. They desire clear direction but not so distant that it becomes confusing. They want a calling that challenges them, yet remains easy enough for others to understand. This tension brings the story of Gideon alive beyond mere history, because there is something truly terrifying about standing in front of all that provides you security and hearing God say, "There is too much. Too many people. Too much visible support. Too much reliance on what can be counted and seen." That statement confronts us deeply. We often assume that having more support means we're more prepared. More numbers imply greater strength. More voices around us provide safer ground. But heaven doesn't always see things the way we do. Sometimes the very things that comfort us can weaken our obedience. Gideon had finally gathered an army he trusted like never before. The setup made a victorious outcome feel reasonable, even assured. And yet, before the battle even began, God interrupted that comfort. Why? Because when victory is grounded in visible resources, it risks becoming more about human reassurance than true dependence on God. This is not just an Old Testament lesson. It is a spiritual pattern repeated throughout time. God often reduces what we are tempted to trust more than Him, not out of cruelty, but because He is jealous for the center of our confidence. Gideon started to realize that his shrinking army wasn't necessarily a sign of losing support. It might have been God redefining what true support should mean. That kind of deep shift is harder than most people realize. When you're used to consistent relational affirmation, a reduction of people feels dangerous. Yet spiritually, this kind of reduction can be the first step toward purification. We say we trust God, but still want enough companions nearby to soften the cost of obedience. We say He alone is enough, but quietly hope the crowd stays full while we become who He is calling us to be. This is the reality for most. That's why seasons of thinning feel especially exposing. They don't just cut down your circle, they reveal what your heart still clings to alongside obedience company. Days, witnesses, applause, confirmation. And when those begin to fade, faith must stand up without the emotional supports it once leaned on. This isn't punishment, it's training. And the scary part is, this kind of training rarely feels honorable in the moment. It often feels like emptiness, lack of support, or something being taken before we understand why. But God isn't always taking away what's bad. Sometimes He is pruning what has grown too noisy, to clear space for deeper devotion. That's why spiritual filtering can feel so much like loss initially. Both loss and filtering are quiet. Both hurt. Both leave open space. But loss means something precious has disappeared. Filtering means something unnecessary is being moved aside. One of the hardest lessons in growing spiritually is learning not to mistake filtering for loss. He still longed to recapture that old sense of fullness. That's often what we do when silence becomes uncomfortable. We reach out. We push ourselves back into the noise. We make ourselves more available than peace actually allows. We desperately try to recover the emotional volume we once had, instead of pausing to wonder if God might be intentionally turning the volume down. He felt that pull too. The temptation to be easier, to be funnier, to tone down the intensity, to become more available again, to say less, lighten the mood, make the room feel comfortable, and keep the circle wide open. Anything but this quiet. But the quiet didn't go away. It stayed. And slowly, another possibility began to emerge. What if the circle has grown smaller so the signal can come through clearer? What if God isn't withholding from you, but rather interrupting all the noise that's been drowning out your soul's ability to truly hear Him? That's when solitude starts to take on a new meaning. Not at once, but just enough to shift your perspective. Because solitude under God is never empty. It's precise. It purposefully strips away the clutter. It removes what feeds distraction so that your devotion can nourish itself on something far more genuine than mere human attention. Real intimacy with God rarely deepens in seasons crowded with emotional noise. It grows in spaces honest enough for dependence to stop pretending. So if you find your support network feels thinner now, resist the urge to call that a curse. Instead, ask better questions. What has God interrupted that was shaping you too much? What kind of faith can't form while you're still emotionally overfed by relentless affirmation? Who remains close when being near you brings no benefit except the truth? And here, the next layer begins. When love and direction start drifting apart. This tension was tougher still, because it brought with it guilt. Not all separation feels like rejection. Some of it feels like betrayal from your own side. One day, you look around and realize the people beside you aren't headed toward the same places anymore. There's no fight, no scandal, no sharp ending you can neatly explain. Just divergence. This kind of divergence carries its own unique grief. Because you still care. You still remember the history you shared. You still feel affection. But beneath it all, there's a growing awareness that staying emotionally in sync is becoming harder with every step you take. She felt this deeply. The same friends, the same social circles, the same familiar places. But inside, something had shifted. Prayer was no longer only a source of comfort. It had started confronting her. Scripture no longer just soothed her. It began redirecting her. As her inner life grew more serious, some of the conversations around her started to feel like reruns. Not dramatic, just exhausting. Because growth doesn't merely change what you desire. It changes what drains you. Things that once felt normal became repetitive. Cycles that once seemed harmless grew heavy. The same jokes. The same complaints. The same emotional loops. The same resistance to going deeper. When you're the one undergoing change, guilt often shows up before you find clarity. You start wondering if your personal growth is making you judgmental, if your seriousness is turning into pride, or if your obedience is slowly transforming you into someone difficult to walk alongside. In response, many sincere believers do what feels natural. They try to bring everyone along with them. They explain more, invite more, encourage more, tarry more, push more gently, and wait more patiently. They hope that if they can just get others to join them, they won't have to grieve the growing distance or feel that the direction they're moving in is tearing apart what love is trying to keep together. Yet, carrying people who don't want to match your pace leads to a strange kind of exhaustion. At first, it doesn't feel wrong at all. It feels noble, patient, loving, and committed. But gradually, it becomes heavy. What you call loyalty starts costing you clarity, and what you call compassion begins to cloud your discernment. This was the turning point for her. She asked herself the crucial question, am I refusing to leave out of love? Or am I refusing to leave because I can't bear the guilt of moving forward without everyone fully understanding why? That distinction matters deeply. Love and guilt can appear very similar amid transition. She didn't receive a dramatic or overwhelming revelation, no lightning strike or sudden moment of epiphany. Instead, she gained clarity. Not everyone is called to the same pace, the same sacrifices, or the same path. Unity does not mean uniformity, and love doesn't always mean sharing the same direction. These truths sound obvious until you have to live them. Abraham demonstrated this kind of obedience. He was told to go without a complete map, without detailed explanations or guarantees that those around him would understand his decision. All he had was a call, a command to leave, and a promise. This example highlights a conflict many avoid admitting. People want to obey God without losing emotional approval from those who know them. They want to move forward without being misunderstood, to follow a calling without feeling the pain of divergence. But often, the direction you're called to sounds harsh to those who wanted you to remain available. Obedience can feel selfish to those who benefited from your staying put. That doesn't make obedience selfish, it makes it costly. The hardest part of this cost isn't always the leaving itself, but the feeling that saying yes to God may sound like saying no to people you still love. Eventually, she understood something both freeing and heartbreaking. She wasn't abandoning those she cared about. She was simply no longer assigned to stand in the same place. That truth, while simple in words, can take months to embrace with peace. Many confuse constant agreement in relationships with faithfulness. But faithfulness sometimes means moving in a way others can't follow or fully grasp. Sometimes it means walking tenderly while accepting that not every shared past can become a shared future. Maturity isn't cold. It's something much deeper. And often, growth and maturity don't feel celebrated, especially when they're costing you a sense of emotional balance. So, if you've ever felt guilty because the direction you're following no longer aligns with the paths of those you love, listen closely. Diverging doesn't always mean dividing. Sometimes, it simply means being reassigned. When the call of God becomes clearer, some paths naturally separate, not because love has faded but because obedience refuses to circle around endlessly. Healing adds another layer, one even more personal than calling itself. People love the idea of healing until they realize what it's truly about. From afar, healing appears beautiful, even inviting. But up close, it's disruptive. Healing doesn't just erase pain, it reshapes you. It alters what you can tolerate, changes your reflexes, redefines your sense of normal, and challenges how much of yourself you're willing to set aside just to feel accepted. As your shape changes through healing, some spaces no longer fit you without strain. That's a new kind of discomfort. You sense it in places once familiar and easy. Conversations that used to flow comfortably now weigh heavier. Emotional patterns you overlooked become glaringly obvious. Social rhythms once harmless confine you in unexplainable ways, and explaining only risks sounding dramatic. Part of you might miss your old self not because that former version was healthier, but because it was easier. Easier to be included, easier to protect, easier to keep close. The old you could overlook warning signs to belong, laugh through discomfort, give too much without naming it, and remain available even when it costs your peace. Healing strips away that kind of flexibility. This is where grief settles in. Becoming whole brings grief, because the old version of you, while not authentic or healthy, was easier for others to keep around. It belonged everywhere, but only superficially. Boundaries expose this truth quickly. When you stop saying yes by default, some people get confused. When you stop tolerating what drains you, discomfort arises. When you refuse to sacrifice your needs just to keep the peace, certain relationships reveal how much they relied on your unhealed self. That's a difficult place to be. The temptation strikes immediately. Go back. Loosen up. Stop being so cautious. Stop being serious. Give people the old version of you again, not because it was right, but because it was familiar. That's how temptation sounds during healing, not like blatant rebellion, but like nostalgia whispering. Just go back to what was easier. Healing doesn't erase that pull, it makes it visible. The lonelier you feel, the stronger the temptation to shrink yourself so others have room again. That's why Scripture speaks about the old passing away in such uncompromising terms. There's no sentimentality. It's severe. Because when the old you disappears, the spaces made for that old version begin to disappear too. God doesn't restore you just so you can comfortably remain in environments that once shaped your dysfunction. No, He restores you so you can clearly see what truly threatens your freedom, before you mistakenly call those threats normal again. But this kind of recognition doesn't come without its costs in your relationships. Some people may mistake your healing for distance. Others might label your healthy boundaries as pride. And to some, the clarity you gain could feel like rejection because your old self was simply easier for them to handle. That doesn't mean you've become less loving. Healing has many layers. And when those layers shift and expand, sometimes the rooms you once fit into start to feel too small. That was a powerful truth he had to learn and trust. Some rooms are indeed too small. Not because you're better than anyone else, but because you're no longer made to survive by shrinking yourself to fit the molds God has already set you free from. Even Jesus experienced the social cost of speaking truth, not because truth lacks compassion, but because truth unsettles systems that depend on endless tolerance of things that no longer deserve to be central. So, when healing makes certain environments feel tighter or less welcoming, don't automatically assume you're at fault. It might simply mean your soul can no longer breathe in spaces that once strained it to settle for less freedom than God intended. Alignment can feel lonely before it brings peace. It feels constricted before it feels clear. It carries social costs before it offers spiritual stability. But know this: the loneliness isn't where you're headed, it's the hallway you must pass through. And in that hallway, something vital is being formed. The healed you is learning not to bargain with old environments just to avoid being alone. That's far more important than it might seem. Because if you shrink back every time healing changes the social atmosphere around you, you're not truly healing. You're negotiating. And what God desires isn't a shinier version of your old compromises. He wants freedom so solid that it can stand firm, even when fewer people understand you. So, if your circle has shifted since you began healing, it might not be a sign of isolation. It could be proof you're no longer entangled in the patterns that once kept you emotionally fractured. Then came the next turning point, one that didn't come with a spiritual high or a sudden breakthrough, but with a deep, undeniable need. Life became heavier than he anticipated. Pressure mounted. Fatigue deepened. Family demands, mental exhaustion, unanswered prayers, and piling responsibilities crept in. Suddenly, he wasn't the one offering strength anymore. Now, he quietly needed it. And that shift affects relationships in ways more profound than most expect. At first, on the surface, nothing seemed to change. He still showed up, still responded, still kept his composure. But beneath the surface, the emotional transformation had already begun. He was no longer the one offering energy. Instead, he was seeking support. The encouraged had become the one quietly asking, "Would you pray for me?" No longer the unshakable pillar others leaned on. He was learning firsthand what it feels like to be in need. This subtle role reversal revealed more than any conflict ever could. Many people find comfort in your presence only when you're strong, available, useful, entertaining, generous, responsive, and emotionally self-sufficient. But vulnerability need unsettles them. Not necessarily because they are unkind or uncaring. Sometimes, need disrupts the version of you they preferred, the version who asked for nothing, who made their own life seem easier, who gave far more than was ever asked in return. This is why hunger exposes the true nature of companionship so sharply. When you have something to give, many naturally gravitate toward you. But when you bring nothing but honesty, everything changes. The prodigal son knew this well. As long as there was an abundance, the house was filled with company. As long as there was celebration, the voices were loud and joyful. But when the resources dwindled, so did the crowd. Hunger peeled back the comforting illusion. This remains true today, albeit in quieter ways. You stop sharing victories on social media and instead send a message that reads, "I'm struggling." You stop giving energy freely and find yourself asking others to pray for you. You stop sounding bright and upbeat all the time, choosing instead to be candid and honest. And suddenly, the responses slow down. Some vanish altogether. Some replies come selectively. Many simply don't know how to relate to the version of you who isn't contributing something immediately enjoyable or useful. That silence is painful, because when vulnerability meets silence, it feels deeply personal. But sometimes, silence reveals the truth. Not a pleasant revelation, but a necessary one. It exposes who was attracted to your strength and who was devoted to your person. It separates those who valued what flowed from you from those who can sit with who you are when the flow diminishes. In such a season, God feels different too. Not because God changes, but because your need strips away all pretense. You realize that much of your life was more about performance than you understood. Not exactly falsehood, but endlessly output-centered, always pouring, always functioning, always carrying some visible role. Need interrupts this rhythm. Need challenges you. Now let's see if your faith endures without the show. Now let's see if your identity holds when all you can offer is truth. Now let's see if you can receive, not just be accepted through what you provide. This realization humbles you. But it is also sacred, because honesty carves out a spiritual space that performance never could. He stopped pretending to be strong in prayer. He stopped packaging and concealing his pain. He stopped making it sound like he had already processed what was still deeply breaking him. And that is when God became unmistakably present. Not because the problems disappeared, but because the false support vanished. When the support from people around you starts to fade, it's often the divine presence that becomes clearer, not through overwhelming emotion, but through sheer necessity. You begin seeking God, not because it brings drama, but because all other places feel like pretending. This kind of hunger is what matures true faith. It strips away the ability to survive on just a spiritual image or showmanship. It removes the performative strength from your bones. It lessens the desire for spectators and deepens the need for genuine presence. And when this transformation happens, something profound becomes clear. Those who remain with you when all you have to offer is raw truth aren't just rare, they're absolutely essential. They're not connected to your achievements or productivity. They're connected to who you are as a person. So if your circle shrinks when life becomes hard, don't rush to see that as a punishment. Difficult seasons don't just test your spirit, they reveal your environment. This revelation, though painful, is often part of how God teaches you the difference between being merely appreciated and being truly carried, between being admired from afar and being deeply loved. Then comes another kind of pain, more subtle, more humiliating. Social doors start closing not with a dramatic slam, but as a steady quieting. There's less inclusion, less automatic access. Replies become shorter, conversations end quicker, and you hear about plans only after the fact instead of naturally being part of them. This kind of silence plays tricks on your mind because the first response is usually to blame yourself. Maybe you became boring. Maybe you got too serious. Maybe you lost the spark that made people enjoy your company. Maybe something inside you changed, and now no one wants you around the same way anymore. This isn't merely fear of being alone, it's a deeper fear, the fear of being unwanted. And being unwanted strikes at the very core of your identity. She felt this acutely, the invitation that never came, the unanswered message, the social warmth that used to flow easily but now seemed withheld. It made her insecurities loud and insistent. But she hadn't yet realized that not every closed social door means rejection. Some doors close as forms of protection. God does not only open doors that lead to new places. He also closes doors to cycles that kept you returning to versions of yourself he no longer wants defining your life. That truth is harder to celebrate than most admit because protection often looks harsh before it reveals its wisdom. The room that used to embrace you starts to resist you. The dynamics that once felt harmless become exhausting. The environment that welcomed your smaller self now becomes stifling as God expands your integrity. Your mind may whisper, you became less desirable, but your spirit knows better. You became less available for what no longer fits the assignment God has for you. That's a completely different lens to see through. And this shift in understanding changes not only how you interpret your experiences but also how long you can endure them. When you believe that social distance means you've lost your value, it's tempting to push hard to regain old access and acceptance. But what if some doors close not because you've been rejected, but because God is gently rescuing you from spaces where you had to keep diminishing yourself just to fit in? Suddenly, the silence and distance feel different, they take on a new meaning. Instead of asking, why am I not included? You start to wonder, what did being included cost me before? Now, that's a mature and powerful question. Many people don't actually miss the space itself. They missed the familiar identity they were allowed to play inside it. Yet, God is too kind to let you continue shrinking just to fit in. This is why living a set-apart life often means fewer seats at some tables, not because holiness makes you superior, but because it changes what you're available for. You're no longer open to everything, no longer willing to laugh at just anything, no longer able to participate in whatever keeps acceptance easy at the expense of your peace. And peace? It comes at a high price in environments built on compromise. Temptations show up there, too. Go back for just one evening, they say. Respond the way you used to. Blend in. Don't make it so hard. Recover your old access. It rarely sounds sinful. Usually, it sounds nostalgic. But nostalgia can be a fierce enemy of discernment, especially when God is carefully closing old doors. Remember, God isn't a crowd manager, he's a shepherd. Shepherds lead their sheep away from dangerous edges the sheep themselves don't yet see. That's why some closed doors are so frustrating. You feel trapped before you understand you're being rescued. So, if your social access is changing, don't rush to pry every old door open. Some close because you were rejected, but some close because God refuses to watch you exhaust yourself trying to belong in places that only accepted you when you stayed diluted. Silence in these moments isn't always a loss of worth. It can be the end of performance-based belonging. And painful as that may be, this kind of ending is holy. Now there's another stage in all this that can feel almost unfair. You're not trying to stand out, preaching to everyone, or making a scene. You simply stop negotiating certain things. You stop laughing when your spirit says no. You step away from what once felt normal. You speak more carefully, and you make different choices in small, quiet ways. Yet, even without loud words or dramatic actions, the atmosphere shifts. Because light doesn't need to be loud to cause tension, it just needs contrast. He learned this the hard way. His boundaries were quiet. His changes were subtle. Still, people notice not because he became self-righteous, but because he no longer joined in things that no longer felt right to him. That alone unsettled his surroundings more than most might expect. Jokes felt awkward now, small compromises stood out, and the old comfort vanished. And then, as often happens, the labels follow. You used to be part of the group, but then you changed. You grew more serious, more church-focused, maybe even a little intense. While the tone might stay somewhat playful, beneath the humor lies a subtle unease. This kind of discomfort sparks one of the most challenging internal struggles for any believer. Am I overdoing it? Am I becoming too much? Should I ease up just to keep things feeling normal? Am I truly being faithful, or am I just making things socially awkward? Daniel understood this pressure intimately. He didn't launch loud attacks against Babylon. Instead, he quietly resisted assimilation. His choices seemed small, but they carried profound consequences. In fact, holiness often causes distance long before it wields influence. This dynamic remains the same today. Silent faithfulness can disrupt social harmony without anyone raising their voice because it unveils alternatives. It reminds others that compromise isn't the only path, even if they prefer to ignore that truth. People don't always welcome reminders of what they're resisting. That's why faithfulness frequently feels lonely before it gains strength. Many want to soften their stance, self-edit, or hide the sharp edges. They try to signal enough similarity to keep everyone comfortable. Such temptation is natural. Nobody enjoys being the one who shifts the group's emotional temperature by refusing to follow the old ways. Yet integrity usually feels socially costly before it becomes a source of internal peace. That's the price paid. Conviction shows truths unspoken by words. And some groups find it easier to accept a fractured version of you rather than a clear, unwavering one. So when your presence causes discomfort because your inner light is growing, don't automatically assume you're in the wrong. Sometimes, the unease people feel isn't correction but contrast, and contrast often proves transformation is genuine. If your circle shrinks because you stop dimming the work God is doing in you, that isn't failure. It's simply the social cost of clarity. Clarity prepares you for relationships that don't require you to stay confused just to keep others comfortable. It leads you to realize the crowd was never equivalent to love. There is grief in discovering that what you thought was love was something else entirely. For so long, being surrounded by people felt safe, the phone always buzzing, conversations flowing, invitations piling up. Constant interaction made life feel full. But fullness can be misleading when measured only by quantity. At first, he didn't see the difference. Why would he? Attention feels warm. Noise feels alive. Being sought after seems like value. Then a difficult season came suddenly, and everything shifted. The voices quieted. Those who were always near became strangely distant. The crowd that once made him feel important now seemed impossible to reach. And in the silence came a harsh question: if I'm not useful right now, do people still want me? That question cuts deep because it exposes a truth many evade for years. Not every bit of attention you receive is true affection. Not every opened or means genuine love. And not every moment of presence signals unwavering loyalty. Sometimes, people don't truly love you, they love the version of you that's easy to use. They crave your energy, your generosity, your availability. They rely on your sense of humor, your usefulness, and the way you help keep emotional connections running smoothly. But when your utility starts to fade, those connections weaken. What feels like betrayal? Often, it's just the truth coming to light. Jesus himself lived amid this tension daily. Crowds flocked when there was bread to be shared, miracles to witness, spectacles to marvel at, healing to receive, and a promise of immediate reward. But when the path narrowed, when suffering, surrender, and sacrifice beckoned, the crowd quickly diminished. This didn't mean love had vanished. Instead, it revealed the kind of love that had been there all along. Jesus felt the weight of that realization deeply. He had mistaken being surrounded by people for being truly known. He had confused being sought after with being cherished. He had equated constant access to real, heartfelt attachment. And once the noise in the crowd vanished, the stark difference became impossible to ignore. This is precisely where God begins a more subtle, profound work. He starts staring down the notion that belonging depends on performance. That kind of belonging can seem deeply fulfilling for a long time. As long as you're strong, responsive, helpful, impressive, and emotionally available, the system rewards you with visibility and attention. But it's exhausting, because it teaches your heart to believe that love grows with what you produce. That is not love. It's transaction, cushioned by familiarity. God's love operates differently. It doesn't ebb and flow with your usefulness. It doesn't retreat when you're tired. It doesn't disappear when you become silent. It doesn't demand constant output to stay constant. And when God starts teaching your heart this kind of love, some in the old crowd will naturally drift away, or else you risk mistaking access for affection all over again. So when the noise fades, don't rush to fill the space. Let the emptiness teach you. Let it show you how much your emotional stability depended on staying busy in other people's lives. Let it uncover where being needed became a stand-in for being deeply rooted. Because what you might be losing isn't love at all. It might be mere access. It might be an audience. It might be a system that kept offering rewards as you stayed available, but in ways that slowly drained your inner self. And what remains after this shedding, though smaller, is far more truthful. That honesty is painful, but it is also the starting point for true discernment. Now consider the ache of exclusion and the rebuilding of identity. There's a particular kind of wound, not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes, it creeps in quietly, during moments of scrolling. A photo pops up, a story unfolds. A room filled with familiar faces. A new step forward that you're not a part of. And suddenly, your chest tightens. No one has outright said you're unwanted. No one has sent a message of rejection. No one has formally shut you out. But the evidence is undeniable. Life goes on, and you're not in it. And in moments like these, the mind does what it always does. It breaks the silence with a single, weighty sentence: "I was replaced." This phrase carries a deeper heaviness than most realize. Exclusion doesn't only wound us on the surface, it strikes at the very core of our identity. The pain goes beyond missing out on an event. It asks painful questions like, was I less meaningful than I believed? Was I easier to forget than I imagined? Did I only matter when I was physically present? This is why many people react so quickly after being excluded. They post updates, perform publicly, signal loudly, they make noise to reclaim their space in the world. It's not necessarily out of shallowness, but because hidden pain seeks tangible proof that it still exists. Yet, often God gently interrupts this impulse, in a manner that feels both severe and tender. He invites you into a quieter room, not a place of shame, but one of rebuilding. Here, there's no crowd to manage, no comparisons to make, no social mirrors to borrow your identity from. In moments like these, the secret place shifts from simple devotion to something surgical. God doesn't rebuke your hurt. Instead, He traces it carefully. He reveals where the need to be seen by others has quietly become your source of security, where inclusion became a form of emotional validation too potent to lose without shaking your soul. This kind of honest exposure can bring tears quicker than any theology, because then the wound isn't just theoretical, it's deeply personal. She understood this truth. Part of her worth had become woven with public remembrance, being chosen openly, and inclusion serving as proof of belonging. God didn't shame her for this realization. Instead, He began to heal it, slowly, tenderly, and thoroughly. This is what secret places do when God is rebuilding identity. They remove the temptation to borrow worth from visibility. They nurture contentment in places where applause cannot reach. They strengthen your true self so it no longer reacts to every ripple in social dynamics. The pain of exclusion didn't disappear overnight, but its power diminished. It no longer defined her, named her, or decided the meaning of her absence. This is a miracle often overlooked, not that the event hurts less, but that it stops dictating who you are. She started to realize that being unseen by people isn't the same as being overlooked by God. When this distinction takes hold, the entire season shifts. Exclusion ceases to be merely a wound and transforms into a teacher. It reveals how much of yourself still depended on external validation. Once that need is exposed, God can heal what constant inclusion only numbed. So if you felt the sting of not being invited, don't rush past it. Let it speak what it came to reveal, not to make you bitter, but to set you free. Because when your identity no longer hinges on constant social recognition, you become harder to manipulate with silence. And that freedom changes everything that follows. When your growth makes those around you uneasy, something unexpected happens. Your circle begins to shrink. It's not about fake growth or superficial changes. Real growth, that profound kind that shifts habits, transforms the way you speak, and makes old escapes less tempting, unworn out excuses harder to accept. From your perspective, it feels like progress. But from others, it often looks like distance. He believed his changes would be embraced. Why wouldn't they be? He was becoming steadier, cleaner, more disciplined, less destructive, more conscious. Yet, instead of joy and celebration, he noticed hesitation creeping in. Responses shifted, support became selective, and the warmth he expected around his progress was surprisingly thin. This hurt in a unique way. It suggested that some people were more comfortable with the struggling, flawed version of him than with the one who was healing and growing. That kind of pain isn't about them hating you, it's about how your healing forces them to confront reflections they'd rather avoid. Growth uncovers more than we often admit. It reveals how our brokenness sometimes made others feel comfortable. It shows who preferred the version of you that was easier to advise, rescue, categorize, or feel superior to. Joseph understood this tension intimately. His dreams didn't foster arrogance in him, rather, they unsettled others. Discomfort with growth often morphs into resistance, and it rarely announces itself in loud, clear ways at first. Instead, it slips in through subtle rejections, a delayed reply, a sarcastic tone, the absence of support, or quietly ignoring the clear changes happening in your life. The real danger isn't the rejection itself. It's the question it stirs within you. Should I dim my growth to keep others comfortable? This is one of the most pivotal questions during any season of growth. Because yes, dimming your light can quickly restore familiarity, but it slowly chokes your calling. Remember, God didn't ask you to grow so you could hide the transformation growth brings. He called you to grow so you could bear fruit. And fruit changes the very ecosystem around you. Not everyone will cheer when you bear fruit. Some will step back, some will fall silent, and some may lose their emotional footing because your progress reminds them of the growth they're postponing. That doesn't mean you should become harsh or superior. Instead, learn to stop interpreting a lack of applause as proof that something is wrong. Sometimes, silence is the very first sign that your change is real. And true transformation always shifts your relationships before it changes your results. So, if growing has made some people less enthusiastic about your presence, don't panic. You're not meant to remain underdeveloped just to keep the room smiling. You're called to flourish. And flourishing frequently creates distance before it invites others to witness your journey. Finally, after all the pushback, after all the subtle rejections, comes the slowest and most profound filter of all time. Time never argues. It doesn't announce itself or confront with loud protests. It simply moves forward, quietly and steadily. And as it moves, it reveals truths. Seasons change. Energy shifts. The rhythm of life slows. And the excitement once felt begins to fade. You're no longer riding the waves of momentum or swept up in emotional novelty. Instead, you're just living. It is in these ordinary moments that relationships face their most subtle test, not a test of conflict or drama, but a test of inconvenience. At first, he barely paid attention. People are busy. Life is full. Everyone goes through different phases. It made sense not to read too deeply into anything. But then weeks slipped by. Then months. And a pattern emerged, undeniable and clear. When there were no celebrations to cheer, some bonds weakened. When success wasn't obvious to rally around, some people became distant. When there was no personal gain, no momentum, and no emotional excitement to justify their presence near him, those relationships quietly faded away. This realization was painful but clarifying. He hadn't asked for much, just honesty, presence, and mutual effort. Someone who would stay when the season was simply ordinary. Yet even that simple expectation became rare. And in that scarcity, silence spoke louder than any confrontation could. Some people are tied to your season, not your soul. This is not cynicism. It is wisdom. Ruth offers a powerful contrast to this. When staying no longer promised any advantage, she stayed anyway. When remaining became difficult rather than convenient, she remained steadfast. Her loyalty wasn't loud or flashy, it was steady and true. Time unveils these distinctions clearly. Longevity isn't always loyalty. Shared history doesn't guarantee depth. Familiarity doesn't create covenant. Sometimes, a single answered call during a tough month reveals more commitment than 100 messages in easier times. Recognizing this truth brings a kind of peace, painful yet freeing. You stop pouring energy where it's not reciprocated, stop mistaking long history for present connection, and stop clinging to roots that are no longer there. This isn't bitterness. It's responsible care for yourself. Because once time reveals who stays without gain, ignoring it is no kindness, it's self-betrayal. So if your circle has grown smaller, let that be a lesson. Those who remain when there's nothing obvious to gain are rare, and because they are rare, they matter deeply. What God builds through such relationships is strong and enduring, far beyond what convenience could support. Before God raises your next challenge, He rearranges your company. At some point, the shifts become impossible to overlook. You're growing. Doors are opening and closing. Your direction becomes clearer, and the people close to you begin to change. It feels strange because nothing seems wrong. You're not falling apart or in chaos, you're moving forward. Yet, the space around you grows wider. He tried to fight it. But sometimes, growth means letting go. He paused to explain. He slowed his pace. He made space, patiently waiting for others to catch up. Holding on to past excess, he tried to bring it all into a season that already felt different. But the more he clung to every previous connection exactly as it had been, the heavier the journey became. Progress felt congested, calling felt like a negotiation, and the path ahead was cluttered with the emotional labor of keeping everyone comfortable with what God was doing. That's when another hard truth emerged. Not everyone is meant for every altitude. Some people walk with you for just a season, others for a stretch, for preparation, for recovery, for confirmation, or for comfort. This doesn't make anyone fake, it makes each season real. Before promotion, God often rearranges access not to isolate you, but because new responsibilities can't be carried with old permissions still controlling the emotional environment around your life. Moses understood this. There were moments he couldn't bring everyone along, not because he stopped caring, but because certain encounters require separation. Elevation is often misunderstood. People imagine it as adding, but quite often it begins as relocation. The circle shifts. The noise fades. The support system transforms. Without this understanding, you might mistake the transition for abandonment when it's actually preparation. This is when fear grows loud, the fear of being misunderstood, the fear of seeming proud, the fear that others think you changed in the wrong way, the fear that your obedience will be mistaken for ego. To avoid this fear, many delay moving forward. They stay too long, over-explain, and shrink what God is expanding, just to preserve familiarity. But obedience demands a costly question. Are you willing to be misread to stay aligned? This question weighs heavily because people often see disobedience as open rebellion. Sometimes, disobedience is simply refusing to move forward because the social cost feels too uncomfortable. God isn't removing people from your life to punish you. He's realigning your world to support what He's about to entrust to you. Old access can become a strain when your assignment changes. So if your season feels strangely isolating just before something deeper opens, don't panic. This isolation may not be absence but transition. God might be changing your tribe before increasing your burden. When conviction reshapes who can walk with you, there comes a moment when values stop being negotiable. It usually starts small, a joke you won't laugh at anymore, a conversation you step away from, a standard you quietly uphold, a once yes now no decision. You aren't making speeches or acting superior. You're simply no longer pretending that what's wrong doesn't harm your spirit, and that alone begins to sort the room. She felt it. The silences stretched out longer. Invitations grew fewer and more selective. Glances exchanged between people started to carry weight far beyond words. What once had been effortless connection now felt strained, as if the unspoken understanding that once held things together had shattered. This is the impact of conviction. It disrupts the smooth functioning of relationships that once went unquestioned. Suddenly, internal turmoil sharpens. Am I being difficult? Am I becoming judgmental? Am I standing my ground? Or simply growing hard to be around? That fear is genuine because the boundary between pride and clarity can feel razor thin when you find yourself losing companionship. But Jesus faced that same narrow path. He never sacrificed truth just to keep the crowds around. He didn't soften his convictions to keep everyone comfortable. And as a result, many decided to walk away. Not because love was lacking, but because love spoken without compromise and masks the things people prefer to leave unspoken. This remains true today. Sometimes, All it takes is quietly saying no. That simple refusal can unexpectedly reveal how much a relationship depended on your willingness to remain vague. Not all separations erupt in conflict. Some simply occur naturally once integrity becomes evident. That's why certain social circles change as soon as you clarify your standards. The original bond was built on shared tolerance. When that tolerance is broken, everything begins to unravel. So if your circle shifts when you stop compromising your values, don't see it as failure. Conviction will always cost you closeness to some spaces. But what remains after isn't just emptiness, it's a cleaner, lighter environment capable of growing alongside you. And this renewed space sets the stage for the final realization. Fewer people around doesn't mean less truth. Once your circle thins enough, something unexpected unfolds. That silence changes. At first, it feels like absence, like loss, a glaring proof that something vital is missing. But soon, the feeling evolves. Still quiet, still diminished, still less crowded, but no longer chaotic. He found himself alone in ways he never anticipated. Yet, he was not abandoned. That distinction takes time to grasp. Loneliness often feels the same on the surface, whether it stems from disconnection or from divine refining. But over time, its texture shifts. Chaotic loneliness drives panic. Intentional solitude breeds honesty. In that quiet, prayer deepened not in dramatic displays, but with profound weight. Scriptures stopped feeling like familiar words and began to live in new, challenging ways. Tears fell more freely, not just from pain, but from truth and recognition, from the relief of no longer having to perform worthiness in front of an audience. This is the part few expect. When enough voices fade, you start to hear your soul more clearly. And when your soul no longer constantly reacts to the movements of others, God ceases to be an abstract idea. Elijah experienced this too. He thought he was completely alone, but God showed him not only comfort but perspective. You are not as alone as you believe. That sentence carries immense weight. Having fewer visible people around doesn't necessarily mean fewer genuine connections. In fact, it can often signify that deeper relationships are unfolding beneath the surface. Sometimes, it means that the loud crowd has quieted, allowing the true companions to become clear and recognizable. God begins bringing different kinds of people into your life, people who are less flashy, less performative, and less reliant on constant excitement. These are steady individuals, those who pray, speak truth, and quietly remain faithful. They don't require you to entertain them, to be useful, or to be unendingly strong to stay present with you. More importantly, something inside you begins to change first. You stop measuring your worth by how loud or large your social circle is. You stop panicking when the room falls silent. You no longer react to each departure as if it defines who you are. God becomes enough, on his own, before you add others back into the mix. And this shift changes everything. When God takes the center first, relationships lose the pressure of carrying all the weight of your identity and worth. That was the real aim of the whole season, not deprivation, but reordering. Not emptying for the sake of emptiness, but making space for what is true and lasting. Your circle did not shrink because you were worth less. It contracted because God was refining who truly belongs near the center of your life. The silence wasn't the end goal, it was the process. When that process does its work, what eventually forms is stronger than anything the noise could have sustained. Sometimes it means fewer people. Sometimes it means those few are truer, more authentic. Sometimes it happens later or slower, but always it is real. God removes what is temporary to establish what can bear eternal significance. What felt like loneliness was often an invitation into purer dependence, a cleaner sense of identity, more authentic relationships, clearer hearing, and a deeper devotion. That's why your circle changed, not because your value diminished, but because your life was being refined. So, if you find there are less people around than before, don't rush to think you've been forgotten. If the room feels quieter, don't assume you're being punished. If certain doors have closed, relationships drifted, invitations slowed, or places no longer feel the same, don't interpret all of this as rejection. Instead, ask what God is sorting out. Ask what He's protecting. Ask what used to be too central to your life. Ask what your soul is finally free enough to hear now that the room has thinned. Because what seems like less may actually be how God begins to give you something much more real, not louder, not bigger, but more true. One day, you may look back on this season, which felt so socially empty, and realize it was one of the most spiritually precise times in your life. Not because nothing hurt, but because nothing hidden stayed hidden. God revealed the attachments that bound you, filtering out the noise that clouded your heart. He clarified where your true loyalty should lie and guarded your healing journey. His test stirred your hunger for deeper truth, shutting the false doors that lead to emptiness. He sifted through your values and realigned your circle, all with a purpose. Nothing was random. This was love wielded like a knife, not to injure, but to liberate you. So if your circle shrinks, let it be so. If the room grows quiet, accept it. Those who only stayed because you were convenient, blurry, or endlessly available will lose their place, and that's necessary. What you're left with after this refinement isn't less life, but less confusion. And that clarity is often the first mercy God grants before entrusting you with more. Take a moment to ask yourself honestly, am I gauging my worth by how many people can still reach me, or by how deeply God is grounding me in the unshakable? If this resonates with your journey, share it with someone whose circle has shifted, someone confusing silence for abandonment. And don't miss the next message, because what God does after the thinning is just as crucial as the thinning itself.